Good afternoon, and welcome to this Engage Final Conference. I'm Angel Saz Carranza. I'm a professor of strategy and policy at the SADE Business School, director of the Center on Geopolitics and Business, chaired by Javier Solana, and project director of the Engage Research Project. So this is our final event after 3.5 years of hard work. And we're going to have a great set of speakers. We have divided the event in two parts. First, we're going to have a fireside chat with two former high representatives, Rector Mogherini and Professor Solana, chaired by Rosa Balfour, director of Carnegie Europe. And then we have a fantastic panel chaired by Cornelius Adebar, and with a great set of practitioners and professors or researchers of our project. Before we start, let me just tell you a little bit about our project, a few minutes, before I hand over the floor to Rosa for the kickoff of our fireside chat. So the Engage Research Project was designed back in 2019, actually submitted in 2020, the same week COVID was going through Europe and most of the world, and actually it started in 2021 and finishes in a couple of weeks. Our goal was to contribute proposals, ideas, and recommendations to make the EU a stronger global actor. We are 13 partners in total. The project itself was designed and thought initially with our colleagues from Leuven, with Professor Wouters sitting there. That's where we all started thinking about setting this consortium. And of course, we had Carnegie here, who is organizing this event. But we have also a wonderful set of players: GlobeSec, Groningen, IISS, Edinburgh, Tampere, Sabanci, Iris in Paris, eBay in Barcelona, Hertie School in Berlin, and Natolin College of Europe. The structure of this project was essentially to try to look at external action in all its different dimensions. And I'm not going to go through this messy chart, but just look at the left-hand side, which is the green bluish. And essentially what we wanted to do is look at what the EU does and how the EU affects and is capable of affecting the world beyond its traditional foreign policy. So not only CSDP, looking also at CFSP and what we call External Action Plus. And there what we do is also cover and look at how the EU is interacting in the world in terms of trade, but also with some internal policies like environment or health, and how all of that is playing out. We also had another set of work packages where we then looked at different situations and looked at how the EU, with all these different policies, actually does its external action. And from there, and with this basis, we have then generated plenty of research and a white paper that you have in your seats. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of how much we've done, more than 50 papers, 35 case studies, more than 60 researchers have contributed to this endeavor, 60% of them women. More than 100 practitioners, many of you here, have participated in our workshops and tested our recommendations through 13 workshops around different capitals in Europe. And finally, we've had 20 events. Now, the synthesis of all of this is the white paper, which you have, as I said, you have in front of you, where we actually cover and produce 10 recommendations. The recommendations that will be presented later on by Monica Seuss, who has led this white paper. And by the way, Cornelius is also an author of this white paper, covers different dimensions from the role the High Representative should and could play, QMV, qualified majority voting, special reps, and how we can activate and engage them better in Europe. Global gateway, of course, the defense industry and strategic partnerships. Hopefully, some of these or many of these recommendations will be picked up by the incoming administration here in Europe and improve and strengthen the EU at the global level. With this brief intro, I thank you all again for coming and being here for our last event. This is a very special occasion for all of us, 13 institutions involved, and give the floor to Ms. Balfour, Rector Mogherini, and Professor Solana. The floor is yours.
It's a bit more than a pleasure, to be honest, for me, because I've been looking at European Union foreign policy, and it coincides with the times when Javier Solana was the High Representative. So it's actually, my own professional career has evolved observing you and then observing Federica later. So it's a real privilege for me to be here, and I hope we can talk a bit about EU foreign policy today, but maybe take the long view and also look at how European foreign policy was and what have we learned over the past 2 decades or more. But before we do that, let me just ask you for a quick comment. We've just come out of the European Parliament elections. Everybody's talking about it. I receive a lot of questions. How is this going to affect European foreign policy? I would add to that foreign policy and international affairs are far more present in the public debate. People are voting also on international matters. So do you have, a couple of comments in light of the latest elections, and what do you think, in what ways might they shape the incoming leadership of the European Union? And I'll start with you, Javier.
Okay, thank you very much. The first reaction is I'm a little bit worried about the results of these elections. But being a European and having lived the latest part of the history of the European Union, I think that the Europeans can do whatever they want to do. And I'm very hopeful that this time will be also the same. They will do whatever they want to do. And I hope very much that it will be the better for the European Union. That is my experience, and with that experience, I want to look forward. I don't know how long I will live to see it, but I'm sure that we will not be neglected from history. We will continue to react to that point, and I hope that will be very much more worried I am today with what's going to happen in November. In November, we have a third round of the world elections, and that is going to be very, very important also for us. Very important for the Americans, very important for us and for the world.
Thank you. So craft foreign policy and not less events shape Europe. Federica, how do you see it?
Yes, well, first of all, let me join you, Rosa, in saying how pleased I am to be here, but also a little bit emotional because Javier knows that very well. I consider him my mentor and my inspiration when I was nominated High Representative. The first thing I did was to talk to him and ask for advice. So for me, I'm actually here more to listen to him than to tell you what I think. So great to be here together. In principle, European elections or European Parliament elections don't have an impact on the EU foreign policy because this is competence of the Council. So in principle, we can say nothing changes. But in reality, I think that there will be two kinds of changes, I fear. On one side, all the external impact of internal policies. I imagine that on migration, on trade, on human rights, the external projection of internal policies, the Green Deal or whatever it will be of it, the external projection of internal policies will potentially change as the Parliament shifts to the right, regardless of what the political majority will be in support of the President of the Commission. And the second element is a more, I would say, imperceptible element. I'm not sure this is proper English, but you understand me. Thank you. And that is the fact that around the Council, around the European Council table, leaders will take into consideration the domestic politics dynamics that relate to European elections. And this will affect, even if the government doesn't change only in Belgium, I think it changes. Still, there will be, I think, an immediate and natural reflection on how the European policies adapt or reflect on the national dynamics. And that, I think, might have consequences, namely on Russia, Ukraine, Middle East, potentially. But then I agree with Javier, the big elections for us will be the US elections in November, where we might potentially either now fear a divergent approach across the Atlantic if Trump is reelected, but we also might fear that in 2, 3, 4 years from now, we might reconverge on a completely different agenda that is Trump-like, and the transatlantic community might be reunited around values and policies that are not the current ones.
Yeah,
that is even more worrying.
Even more worrying.
Yes.
So let's look at the European Union a little bit. Javier, you were High Representative. You were working very well with Chris Patten, who was the Commissioner for External Policy. And the tandem that you created was a little bit the model for looking at how to reform how the EU does foreign policy. And then the Lisbon Treaty failed, the Constitutional Treaty failed, so then we had the Lisbon Treaty, and then after you left, there was, a reformed European foreign and security policy set up. I'm kind of wondering, how do you feel the recipe that worked so well between you and Patten was actually implemented with the treaty? Was foreign and security policy improved in, and pick and choose what you want to look at. What is it that worked well in the years that followed, in your view, and what is it that didn't? Since then, European foreign policy has been severely challenged, right? So there was a peak moment which you and Patten were working, and then there have been several challenges. So, to what extent has you made the right decisions, and to what extent, has it been overly shaped by events?
Well, a very long question. Let me start by saying that I was appointed in the 20th century.
Yeah.
Therefore, I had to go through the September 11. I was in office in September 11. Therefore, we were living in a very complicated world. And I was the High Representative, and I took the job very seriously. And I thought that I had to develop all the matters that were in my definition. My job description was not very long. I really ask you to read it because it's very short. And I thought that everything that was inside, I could do it. And whatever was outside, I could do it also. And therefore, I took that seriously, very seriously, and I did what I wanted to do. And never anybody stopped me from doing what I decided to do. Never in my life I had somebody say no. Always they thought that I would have chosen was the correct thing to do at that very moment. Now, remember that September 11 was a very complicated period of time, and the Middle East, the war in Iraq, all these things happened in my mandate. Very difficult time from the international community. I had a very good relationship with President Clinton. And I thought, and I had prepared, this is the first time I say it, with Vice President Gore, the post-Clinton era. And September 11 changed the whole thing completely. Vice President Gore was not elected, and President Bush was elected, with whom I had no relation whatsoever. And then I have to begin to create a relationship with President Bush and the team. We were not that easy. But we got it, and we got it right. And I had a very good relation with Condoleezza Rice, and I still got the trust of the American government at that time, President Bush, in order to start a negotiation with Iran. It was one of the most important things that I did in my life, and that Federica was happy to finish it. I started it and she finished it. But the starting point was very difficult. The finishing was very difficult also. But what I was very surprised, and I will never forget, is that the whole international community, the permanent members of the Security Council, including the United States, gave to me all the power to start the negotiation. So the High Representative of the European Union at that time was, allow me to say it, quotation marks, an important figure in the international arena and one of the most difficult problems that we had at that time. So that was the respect that the international community had in the European Union. So for me, it was very spectacular what I have to do, and we did it. I didn't finish it, and Federica finished it. But at the same time, we were very active in crisis management. I don't know how many operations I conducted in my period of time, many. I'm going to take two. One, the first military action that we took in Africa. At that time, the United Nations had in Ituri, in Africa, a deployment of the United Nations forces. Those forces at that time collapsed. Kofi Annan was the Secretary General of the UN. And he was a good friend of mine, and he called me. And he told me, could you replace these forces with Europeans? And I said, yes. And we did it. It was a great success. A collapse of the United Nations substituted by a force from the European Union countries. The second one, which is very important today to remember, we did operations in Gaza. We were the first forces that opened the Gaza border with Egypt. And that were forces of the European Union, military and police. It's very interesting to remember those things because those things happened some time back. But we were able to do this type of things with a unity of command, a unity of purpose, with the European Union fully behind what decision the High Representative had to take. So this has changed really, and that is a very important thing to remember, that has changed. The relationship between the High Representative and the Council, the High Representative and the European nations, it is today a little bit different. I don't know if for the better or for the worse, but different in any case. Now, one thing that I didn't have, that for me was very important, because I found, I thought that I had to have it in order to complete my portfolio. You know? I never chaired the meetings of the foreign ministers. The foreign ministers meeting council was chaired by the rotating president. So that for me was one of the problems that I had. I had every X number of months change the presidency of the European foreign minister. But at the same time, I was member of the European Council, which was very important. Now, the Lisbon Treaty changed all that thing. But really, with a definition that is very short, as I said before, my job description is a line. I mean, we did a lot of things. Probably, when I think back, the more defined you have your job, the less able will be to do it properly.
Thank you. Well, yes, that leads me to you because
Your job description was a bit longer.
Exactly. So, how was it for you? I mean, there are two elements here. The one is the job description, and the other is the international context and the ability to act on the international context. So, can we just play around a little bit with these two elements? Let's perhaps start. Well, you start where you want to start, but just your job description and the international environment.
I think what Javier just shared tells us a couple of lessons that I think are good to keep in mind as we enter the next institutional cycle. One is that job descriptions and institutional framework is important because indeed can give you instruments and power, like chairing the Foreign Affairs Council, like being Vice President of the Commission, which I found personally one of the most powerful instruments in my hands, especially when working on defense, but also on the Iran nuclear deal implementation. The connection with the powers and the resources and the DGs of the Commission were, for me, an asset that was incredibly important. But it's not enough. And I think Javier, during his mandate, showed that many things can be done outside of the job description if you have the will and the strength and the power, I would say, the relations and the international environment that allows you to do that. I think that the strength of the political will in the European Union is what counts more than anything else. We see that sometimes, not only on foreign policy, but also on other things, we managed to go beyond the competencies and the treaties even. Now, some professors can forgive me for that, but it's true. I mean, even in the last couple of years, we've seen competencies stretched beyond the treaties because of a political necessity. And that, I think, what happened during your times, where you were High Representative without the Lisbon Treaty, but with a lot of power and capacity to do. And sometimes we see that provisions are on paper in the treaties, but are not really put in place. For me, the instruments that were most relevant and powerful were being the Vice President of the Commission, which is something I played at the maximum I could, and the possibility, yes, and the chair of the Foreign Affairs Council, and especially the connection between the different formations of the Foreign Affairs Council, foreign ministers, defense ministers, development ministers, and the European Council. And actually putting those strands of institutional work together on some files was what really made the difference for me. Having said that, the international framework is the other element indeed that changes completely the equation. I experienced both I would say, the positive environment and the most challenging environment. You moved from Clinton to Bush. I moved from Obama to Trump. It makes a difference. It makes a difference. And even with exactly the same institutional instruments and with the same political will, the international framework changes the impact of your action. And it's not only the transatlantic partnership, it's the way in which the US leadership affects the multilateral system. For me, there is a clear dividing line. Before 2016, we were still able to do things together with the US, but most importantly, we were able to do together with the US things together with the others. In the UN framework, the Iran negotiations, the climate change Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, it was still in the framework of doing things together globally. And the EU is an instrument of multilateralism. And as you said, it works when it works with the UN, with the US, with others in the world. After 2016, for me, we entered into a space where it was mainly damage control. And then your objective power, even if institutionally and politically your power stays the same, the impact of what you do in a framework that internationally is not multilateral anymore has a limit, because what you can do alone in the world is very limited to some areas, the Balkans, some parts of the neighborhood, but there are other things on which you need to work with others. And if the others are not there, you have to be realistic on what you can do. So I think that indeed it's a combination of these two elements. The political will, obviously the institutional framework, and most of all the political will, sometimes also the personality and the chemistry. You were asking about how it worked. I was lucky, it worked well also in my case. It's not only being lucky, it's also about building, I think, a cooperative ways of working across institutions, within institutions, but also the international environment, absolutely, yes. But I fully agree with what Javier said. I think the most important lesson to be learned, especially for the HRVP, especially for the one that will come, is to do what he or she believes it's right to do without asking for permission, because Otherwise, you self-censor yourself, and the role diminishes its impact automatically. And this is not something that is written in the treaties. This is something about how you interpret the role.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to this. But first, let me just ask you a very specific question, because both of you have actually done a lot on defense and security. You brought a lot of innovation. You had CSDP, so that's, you launched several CSDP missions. I think now the picture on crisis management has changed a lot. You did PESCO, NATO-EU cooperation. And my question is, there is a lot of talk about having a defense commissioner. And I'm wondering, how would that person, in your view, how ought that person, or those powers, or those competences, relate to the High Rep? I mean, should this be something where, the High Representative has a bit more of a role than, or less of a role with respect to hypothetical next commissioner? And I'm asking this because you're now free to speak.
I was free to speak also before, and I was always free to speak. And actually, this is something on which I commented already back then, even when I was in office. We had somehow a defense commissioner and the vice president of the commission that together with me was dealing with that. And this was always a subject of discussion publicly and in the College of Commissioners meeting, because it's in this, I really believe that the institutional competences are what count. It's the council and it's the HR that has a competence on defense. There's no doubt about that, and it couldn't be otherwise. But there are competencies, and very important competencies, that lie within the Commission, and that the defense industry and research. These two are not and should not be under the leadership of the HRVP. There is a lot of work to be done, especially on the industry of defense, on which the Commission has competence. At my time, it was Commissioner Biankowska and Vice President Katainen that were responsible for that. We were working well together. It took us a couple of months to clear the space and understand who was competent for what and how to sort it out. But at the end of the day, it worked. And this is why we started with the Defense Fund, and it worked well at that moment. But it took us and our cabinets and our services months to get to an understanding of who leads and on what. But to me, it is crystal clear. The HR and the Council have leadership on defense, and the Commission has leadership and competences on the industry and the research. And one cannot do the other, one should not do the other, and both are needed. It is extremely important, I think, and you can call it Commissioner for Defense, or you can call it Commissioner for Industry, you can call it however you want. Still, the competence is there and will be there, the money is there, and the need is there. So I think that what will be important is to clarify what it is and what it is not, because the Council will never accept a Commission lead on strategic defense decisions, and shouldn't. And I think it is important not to create expectations in the Commission that creating a Commissioner for Defense creates a competence for the Commission. It doesn't. But it is, I think, extremely important to have a Commissioner for Defense that does what needs to be done, which is developing the industry of defense of the European Union scale, which is still very much a matter of also internal conflicts of interest and competition among member states, which is something that the Commission should look at
and
incentivize.
And the expectation also with the public. Javier, would you agree with that?
I cannot disagree, but I didn't have that experience. I never was part of the Commission. And therefore I don't have that problems that Federica had. So I handle with a small group of people. I have a policy unit, very small, but that policy unit produced the first strategy of security of the European Union, which was alive until last year, or something like that. And it was done without any amendment by the Council. So the document that I produced was approved, and that has been the Bible of security in the European Union for a long period of time. So those difficulties with the Commission, etc., I didn't have it. I have a very good relation with the President of the Commission. I had President Prodi most of the time, and I had no problem with him. And I was Chris Patton, who was a very sophisticated United Kingdom diplomat that had been delegate in Harlem, and many things, very important conservative man, but a splendid intellectual, and I had a very good relationship with him. And with him, I traveled with President Prodi. We were in Ukraine, for instance, many times. I have to tell you that in Ukraine, for me, was a very important platform where I started really being a sophisticated foreign policy man. In 2004. 2004 was the first crisis of Ukraine, the most important one, because that was the one in which Putin had a candidate to be president of Ukraine. And the elections were rigged, and I went there. The rotating president didn't want to come, and I was helped by the president of Poland, Alexander Wanieski at the time, and we made the election to be repeated. And that was a victory unsurmountable. Putin had to retreat, and we got an elected president of Ukraine, approved by the whole international community. 10 years later, 2014, 10 years later, was the other crisis, was the crisis with Crimea, with the taking of Crimea. I was not at the European Union. I was not a member of the elite of the European Union. I was retired at that time. I was there, but I think that the European Union at that time did not act proportionally what they should have done with Crimea. I did my job in 2004, but I think in 2014, we were not ready to perform as we did in 2004. And from those misactions, these problems of today.
Yeah, thank you for that, actually. I mean, I think by drawing examples from your life, examples that are still of situations that have only got worse since, I think that's a really good way to look at past and present, and how the seeds of things that were not solved at the time became overwhelming crises today. So let me go back to the sort of political will that you mentioned, the entrepreneurship and the freedom that you had to shape things, and place those, in today's context. So we have a context in which I think for many, the feeling is, so this is a very sort of emotional point rather than an analytical one, that it is events that are crowding our space. And for Europe, it's only a question of identifying the right response. The ambition to try and craft and shape the international environment has shrunk, whereas there's a lot of the engagement is about responding to crises rather than having a sort of global vision, about having a sense of priorities, etc. So that's coming from the outside. And of course, we've all mentioned the US elections. So that is going to be a defining feature for the EU. And whenever someone asks me, what is it, European Parliament elections and foreign policy? So yeah, but let's wait for November. So there's that in terms of external constraints. And then the domestic constraints. Again, talking about political will and talking about entrepreneurship. I mean, it's very hard to imagine the incoming High Representative to have the trust of the 27 member states to actually go out to Ukraine, to go to Gaza and to negotiate the mission on the Rafah border crossing and other special interventions that the EU has done in the past. So in light of this, what advice would you have for the incoming High Representative? Who wants to go first?
Well,
I want to open it up.
I wish you, whoever he is or she is, good luck. But the difficulties of the world of today are much bigger than the ones that I found in my lifetime. Today we have a world in the European Union with the extreme right going up. United States, we do not know where it's going to be in a few months, and a very difficult world. And therefore, to give advice today is very difficult. I wish him or her luck. And believe that we are able to do things. I have to tell you, I never had a problem with the president of the commission. President of the commission in my time was Romano Prodi most of the time, and I had a very nice relationship. We met before, we were professors, both of us before in previous incarnations, and we didn't have any problem. You don't have to be very sophisticated to realize that the High Representative and the President of the Commission at this time, they don't get along so well. And that is very difficult to perform a job when you don't have at the top of the institution a good relationship. In public, I mean, in private you can discuss, but to have it in public is a really misfortune for the European Union. Now, I hope that they will not be repeated in the future, and we will learn from those lessons. We have two very important crises, the Middle East and Russia. I had the same crisis, the Middle East and Russia. And we never had a lack of understanding of how to handle these problems. In public, we had discussions in private, not in public. And this is a very important thing. If we want to be respected, we have to respect ourselves. We will never be respected if we don't act as respectful people. And to have these debates in public is a very stupid thing to do, not to say other words. But I mean, this is stupid. It doesn't lead to anything. Now, I think that because of this dysfunction of the world of today, the rationality of the European Union may be a very important actor. There where I get my optimism, my optimism to the future. If we act properly, if we act coherent, I think we have a place at this time of complicated world to have the European Union being an actor of reasoning, of coherence, of defense of law, defense of human rights, defense of peace, all these things which are really worth fighting for. And I think the European Union can do it, and it should do it. And I wish all my best. They will have all my cooperation to work in that direction. And I think it's a possibility, even in the black cloud that we see in the horizon, we can get a way in which we can be active and properly active for the better of the whole community.
But because after our panel, there's going to be another panel looking at the 10 priorities for European foreign policy, how to strengthen the EU as a global actor. So let me kind of translate. So one issue, it's really important that the institutions work in tandem, but also that they have a positive narrative about what Europe can contribute to the world. Is that what I'm taking from what you're saying? And can I also add, if I may, are you also arguing that perhaps focusing on the crises very close to home, which is what the EU is de facto, doing on the Ukraine front, Josep Borrell is spending a lot of time on Gaza, but I would say that perhaps at the EU level, the attention is not quite as strong. But are you also saying that focusing on the crises that are closer to home is really important also for Europe's global projection? Would you say that those two priorities are the things to look at?
Well, I think you have to look at the world it is.
Okay.
You cannot invent the reality. Mm-hmm. The reality is there, and you have to look at the whole world, the whole number of problems, select the most important ones, be intelligent and focusing.
Yeah.
The European Union, we are intelligent people. Yeah. And therefore we have to work thinking that we have a good analysis and a good body of having this analysis into practice. And without that, you never start doing anything right.
No, I agree. And I think in the European security strategy, which I think continues to be the best written document the EU has ever produced, but you do really focus on, the EU needs to look at regional crises, but with a very global angle, because if we want to be a global actor, this is what we need to do. Whereas I fear that today we are so tied in by our own problems that even dealing with the region close to us is a challenge. So forget about the rest of the world. So that's why I was asking that question.
Historically, the European Union I tried to work with was smaller than today. The first enlargement, big enlargement, took place outside my mandate. So I headed the European Union more handleable, let's put it that way. And so for today, you have not only a bigger European Union, but more diverse, and with other people knocking at your door, and you have to give an answer. So it's much more difficult from the European Union point of view. I'm not saying that my time was miraculous. It was smaller, and it was more sophisticated in the sense that we were more together. But I think that we can get, even in a bigger European Union with the new institutions, I think the attitude of the actors, the attitude of the actors is very important. And I think that it's a sense that should define the European Union. Political actors which are really honest, which really care, which really want to do the job well done. This is our obligation, I think. We are not the United States, we are not China, but we're a different story. It's a story for peace that was born for peace, and we are really wanted to construct a world through the European Union, or with the aid of the European Union, which is a better place, respecting human rights, respecting the values that we Europeans believe. Yeah.
Thank you.
That is for me the game. No?
Federica.
I fully subscribe to what Javier said about, if I had to give just one advice would be, don't underestimate the power of your role. Don't underestimate the power of the European Union. Self-confidence. I think that many times we downplay our own possibilities, our own potential. We also portray a vision, an image of ourselves that is a self-diminishing one, which is counterproductive. So I would say definitely, and not to stop before all those that will tell you, oh, don't go there because you will hit the wall. And so what? I might, but if I don't even try, the wall is still there and I'm far away. Yeah. So I would say, for sure, injecting energy, optimism. I would say the optimism of the will, if I may, in using the potential of the role, because the role of the HRVP is, to me, after the Lisbon Treaty, before the Lisbon Treaty, it was about the optimism of the will and the strength of the profile of Javier. But after the Lisbon Treaty, to me, is the best imagined and best crafted role that one could imagine. You have a lot of power, but you have to be aware of how to use it, and you have to use it, and you have the courage, the patience to build on all the instruments you have. So my first advice would be to inject optimism and strength and to use all the potential. The second advice would be to use the institutional instruments, which is the other way of saying what Javier was saying. First, be the vice president of the Commission, be in the Commission, occupy space in the Commission, exercise power in the Commission, because the Commission works with power logic, and sometimes we refrain a little bit from doing that. So that would be one. For sure, building also very good institutional relations. The High Representative is, the HRVP is at the same time the Foreign and the Defense and the Development Minister of a union where you have three presidents: the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament. And you are not heading an institution. The External Action Service is a service that serves all the institutions. So you have to be able to serve the three. And that has to be your mindset. And this is an exercise that requires connections and patience and building the interinstitutional, intra-institutional cooperation. And then I would say to aim high and not to limit yourself to what is needed. What you were saying at the beginning, do we only need to react to the emergency of the day? And we have plenty of emergencies and very difficult ones, but I still believe that there is an added value in identifying 1, 2, 3 priorities outside of the must-do that are worth investing into. both in terms of geographical scope, because there are many friends out there, and probably after the US elections, there will be even more, plenty of friends out there, even far away, that feel neglected, feel given for granted. And I think it's a good investment to work on partnerships and on situations that are outside of our geographical scope, but also on thematic areas. There are some niche policies that only the European Union can do as we can do. And it would be a loss not to do that. Support to civil society activists, gender, obviously the green transition, it depends on how it will go with the parliament and so on. Empowerment of civil society. There is so much that we can do. And last but not least, enlargement. Have you mentioned that? I hope and I think this would be an advice not only for the HRVP, but also for the President of the Council and the Commission and the Parliament. I really think that either we do at least one step towards the enlargement during this next 5 years, one new member state, or the credibility of the policy will be that. And I really hope, and to me, it is important that the HRVP puts his or her weight behind that. Not only vis-a-vis Ukraine, obviously, or Moldova or Georgia, where the geopolitics of the game are more evident, but also in the Western Balkans. And maybe to invest a little bit of capital and presence there, including on Kosovo and Serbia, that need that level of political weight to move.
Thank you. Some great suggestions. Now, what I'd like to do, you want to add?
Okay. One thing that is very different today. Today, the United Nations is a less active global institution. Today, trade doesn't exist. The rules of the game, the WTO doesn't exist practically. And those were institutions that the European Union liked to work with. They like to work with very profoundly on trade and the United Nations. And that is diminishing. And therefore we have to see how we handle our role in the world, the rule of law, international law, which we were trusting on international law, and today on trade doesn't exist. And the United Nations is not the strength that they used to have. So this is a problem for us because we believe on the rule of law, international rule of law. When the international rule of law is not as valid as it used to be, we are a little bit weaker.
Thank you. Very good point. So we do have a couple of minutes, I think, for questions, right? There is a microphone. We have a couple of hands up. Okay, 3 hands. Fantastic. Is anyone else? Because I'm going to bunch them all together, because I think we're running out of time. So is the mic coming this way? There is one. Okay. And please introduce yourself.
Good evening, Sebastian Whitechurch Brack. I have a question regarding the institutional setup for foreign policy. You mentioned the necessity to enlarge the EU in the next Commission. One of the biggest difficulties for European foreign policy is getting the 27 member states to agree on any policy. And if you enlarge the European Union to another 6, 7 more member states, isn't that going to be more complicated? In the paper you circulated, you draw out one solution, which is to maybe no longer make foreign policy by unanimity, but by majority voting. But I'm an undercover Frenchman. I don't see the French accepting that. You have very different powers within the EU. And to what extent is this a realistic solution to try and get the big countries to agree with? So I'm wondering, going forward, especially with enlargement, what do you recommend the EU should do? I know in practice, there's an informal group of the main powers in foreign policy. Should that be formalized to create a kind of European Security Council to reflect the different powers and different diplomatic potential of the states? Do you agree with this proposal by Carnegie to go towards majority voting? But basically, that's the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, just to be clear, the paper is produced by a consortium of institutions. It's not just from Carnegie. So there were a couple of hands next. Yes. So yes, there you go. And then then we can go quickly.
Sure. Just a quick question to Federica Mogherini. You had a very important legacy, the international cultural relations, role of culture in foreign policy. And given the nature of the current war and the intensity of the soft power, malicious use of soft power by China and Russia, how do you see the next mandate the role of culture, basically, foreign policy, and the role of soft power in general?
Okay, and next, yes, same row.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your remarks. My name is Luca. I'm a Croatian participant from the European Diplomatic Academy, here with my colleagues. I have a quick question for Professor Solana. Given your extensive experience in dealing with crises and the wars in the Balkans in the 90s, do you think that there are any lessons to be learned from that time period and place for the European Union? If any, are they applicable to the current security situation, specifically, say, the war in Ukraine?
Okay, I think we'll start with Federica.
I'll take the first two. First, enlargement and qualified majority voting. This is something I was not saying when I was in office, because my opinion was very different from the opinion of the, at the time, President of the Commission, Juncker, that was very much in favor of qualified majority voting in foreign and security policy. And like Javier mentioned, I thought at the time that it was not good to express diverging opinions in public if you are in the top positions. But personally, and I might be wrong, and my assumption is only based on my experience at the time, and 5 years are a long time, so things might have changed. But personally, I don't think that moving to qualified majority voting in foreign and security policy is a good idea. I would be surprising you, but it depends. If you move to 10 new member states, obviously, then you're up to almost 40, and that is a different thing. But nobody will convince me, having chaired a Foreign Affairs Council with 28 member states, with Boris Johnson sitting at the table, taking decisions by unanimity on defense, and doing that, nobody will convince me that having Albania or Montenegro at the table will make a big difference on foreign and security policy. And I think that if we put qualified majority voting reform before accepting any new member state, this is an alibi not to do it. That is my conviction. I might be wrong, but I don't see how, if we go to a staged approach to enlargement, so not a big wave, but 1, 2, 3 more, maybe already fully aligned, as some are in the Balkans, maybe already NATO allies. I don't see what the problem is on foreign. I mean, really, do we really think that Albania would oppose a foreign policy decision of the Foreign Affairs Council more than any current member state would do? I'm not sure about that. Actually, I'm sure about the opposite. So I think, on the contrary, I think that it is extremely important for foreign policy of the European Union to have the ownership and the buy-in of member states. And the real point is implementation of decisions more than decision making. But again, this is why I'm skeptical. Another thing is if we go to +10, then obviously you have a different kind of setup. But the real difference to me is between the European Union that Javier was dealing with and the one that we have today. I mean, the real difference is in this gap, 27 or 28, again, or 29. I don't think there is a substantive difference in decision-making on foreign policy. But again, going ahead, being 33, 35, 40 member states, then I think we might need to find different ways of having decision-making and maybe concentric circles or things like that. On cultural diplomacy, this was one of those niche positive agendas that are not a necessity. Nobody was asking for it, but it was a nice to have. And to me, it was an important part of the picture, of the puzzle. I understand that this is not today a priority. I hope this can be revitalized because I think it is an important asset for the European Union, not only in terms of soft power, but also in terms of mediation and diplomacy. Through cultural diplomacy, you can reach areas of exchanges and talks that are otherwise precluded, too sensitive, while on the cultural and scientific ground, you can bring together players that otherwise don't talk to each other, while on the cultural and scientific sphere, they can. I remember that with Moedas at the time, we even had a science diplomacy event that was bringing together Israelis and Iranians. So science and cultural diplomacy, I think, can open ways also for traditional diplomacy in a very important manner. And not to forget, there is, I think, a very important economic component. Both in terms of development cooperation, we can finance and promote a lot of projects in many parts of the world through culture that can empower local populations in a very effective way, and also in terms of promotion of the European economy in some areas. This is something that member states do systematically, and I don't see why the European Union shouldn't do that more systematically. So I hope that this will be revitalized in the future.
Javier.
I don't know what question I have to respond, but I think everything has been responded, but yes, I had a little thing. As I said in the last time that I spoke, I said that the rules, the international law for us is fundamental. Today, the international law is broken. Therefore, all the instruments that we have used in previous times are more difficult to be used today. We have to recognize that situation, which is dramatically worse than it was used to be. The international law doesn't exist as it used to be. Therefore, the lessons that we can learn from what we did in the past are not completely applicable today. We have to adapt. I mean, always you have experience when you do something, you get an experience. And that experience has to be analyzed. But again, when the situation has changed as dramatic as it has changed today, it's much more difficult to apply manners, rules, etc., that we used to be able to apply. So creativity is to the essence today, because we cannot apply the rules that we applied yesterday, apply to today. Today is very different than yesterday. Today we have Russia that is attacking, it's declaring that a part of a country that it used to be a country is no longer a country, it's attacked. That situation never was in the Balkans in the manner that it's done today. And that complicates our life very much, because Russia used to be not an ally, but a really companion in many, many things, and energy and so many things that today we cannot do it. So it's a big change, the relation with Russia for the European. Don't forget that geography is geography. This is something that's not going to change. Russia is going to be our neighborhood today, yesterday, and tomorrow. So therefore, when that relationship changes, it creates in us a much more difficult problem. And that is why we have to adapt our mindset to the realities of today, but never forgetting what we are. And we are a group of countries that want to live in peace. Our message is a message of peace. We were created because we wanted peace, and we didn't want war again. But this is very beautiful to be said when the surrounding is like that. But when we have somebody that attacks us, we have to defend ourselves. And that doesn't go against our principles. But we prefer much more to be in the old times in which we could continue to do things according to the international law. And that is our wish. But is our wish, not the wish of everybody. That is a thing. No, the whole world is not European.
Thank you very much. Now, allow me, we are Cornelius, panelists for the next session. Apologies, we stole some time from you. So while you come up to the panel, please join me in thanking Javier and Federica. It was really great.
So quick change of scenery, as I said, and thank you all, the three of you, for continuing the discussion. A discussion that, if only by its title, is meant to focus a little more on the post-election perspectives and what has been termed the 10-point plan, because fear not, researchers and academics have been sitting for 3 years together and have hammered out a 10-point plan of what the European Union could be doing. And if, in case you were wondering, Angel was kind enough to refer to it. Rosa mentioned it. This is also a discussion of the substance of the research of the Engage project. And I'm very happy that we can dive into this with two researchers which were part of the consortium, and with Tanya from the EAS, from the External Action Service, as someone who is watching this from the inside of the machinery, whereas we have been working with the machinery. It was alluded to the fact of the numbers of papers that were written, the stakeholder outreach meetings that have been taking place in this project, the kinds of interaction with policymakers during the course of the research, and all this to fit into a policy paper, which then got drilled down to 10 recommendations. So my first question, I'm being very quick on this now, Monica, the gist of it. How do you summarize what the research consortium has come up with, and what is the most important thing for the next leadership?
Thank you, Cornelius. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I must say, I'm not only honored, but also really humbled because I feel like behind my back, there's 50 people that are also in the room, but also some that were not able to come here, that worked over 3.5 years and produced as many papers as Angel was actually presenting you before. So now I have the pleasure to basically summarize 3.5 years research within 5 minutes. So that's a challenge that I think it's not really so easy, but I will try to do my best. You all have the white paper basically on your seat, so I won't refer to every bit of that. And before, perhaps I will give, I decided to give you three key messages that I have, some extent, distilled again from the 10-point plan. So as you see, we are distilling and distilling even more. But before that, let me just very briefly say that, and I had referred to that when we started the project 2019, or we started the proposal, the pandemic was not there, of course. And then when we started to work on the project, we not only had the pandemic, but we also had, of course, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and of course the Gaza war, and many other conflicts around the world. And we struggled a bit as researchers, to catch up with the tempo of the world developing. But nonetheless, we really tried to stay relevant in our final observations, to put it this way. So the first 4 recommendations that you see in the paper go more into the direction of institutional reforms, perhaps, and observations, and the other 6 are more, let's say, content-oriented. But as I said, I won't present you 10 of recommendations. I have selected 3 topics that I would like to share with you. And I hope that these topics perhaps would trigger further discussion among panelists, but also with the audience. So my first point is strategic selectivity. It has been mentioned before by the previous panel that the EU, and this is also something that we discovered in our research, that the Union's resources basically are overstretched across too many regions and too many domains to some extent. And to address these shortcomings, we think that the EU has to become far more strategically selective. This is something that the previous panel has been already alluding to. And what we mean by strategic selectivity is basically the way how the EU pursues its interests and goals according to the global strategy that Federica Mogherini put forward, but also then to the strategic compass. So we do not argue that we need another strategic document. We think we have enough strategic documents within the EU. We just put the point that we should pursue the strategic goals in a selective way to some extent. And the point that we see is basically that given the limited resources that the Union has, and then the member states, of course, also have, and resource scarcity is something that is also very present, for example, now in the picture of NATO, the Union must basically intentionally decide which regions and crises it engages and how can it do it in the most effective way. In order, to be relevant for the world, basically. What it means and how it translates into practice is basically to critically review, improve, and phase out, perhaps even, some of existing mechanisms and instruments. And to this end, what we think is that the EU must leverage its weight in trade, investment policy, financial power, diplomatic presence, and rule-making capacities. So we do talk a lot also about values that underpin the whole European project. And of course, then at the same time, steadily but increasingly developing security and defense capabilities. So in other words, we do not see the EU as another, like normal geopolitical actor, perhaps as Russia or China, but we see the EU much more as an actor promoting rule-based order, even despite the challenges that actually are absolutely now facing the international order, with the authoritarian states basically trying to take over the narrative. So this is the first thing, and I think that many of these points of the previous panel also allude to this point. Then to this end, and this is my second point, the EU, among others, needs to leverage its institutional framework. Again, you have 4 recommendations in the white paper going into this topic. One of them, and this is not a coincidence that we had 2 high representatives here in the previous panel, we do think that the EU can leverage the position of the HRVP definitely more than it was the case, or actually it still is the case in the current institutional framework. And we argue that this is actually something that the new EU leadership should definitely go for. We do see, and this is something that Federica Mogherini mentioned, as you know, there are many provisions on paper, and these provisions are really very good, elaborated in the Lisbon Treaty, but there's also some leeway that actually the High Representative can, of course, use to increase its powers. But what we have seen actually is that the position has been strongly restrained among over the last 5 years, but by, on the one hand, lack of alignment among the member states, but also by the rivalry between presidents of the European Council and of the European Commission. And of course, we are aware of the fact that it won't change overnight, and we are still talking about strong personalities that want to be, powerful in all these positions. But nonetheless, we think that the new European Commission should definitely give the office holder an executive role overseeing the commissioners with external portfolios, including humanitarian aid, neighborhood enlargement and development. And if you allow me, just one final point on that note regarding the Commissioner for Defense Industry. We do call it in our white paper very consciously Commissioner for Defense Industry. We still think that this position should not risk a further fragmentation of the EU institutional construct. And in order to avoid that, we see that this position should also report and be coordinated by the HRVP in the role, of course, of the incumbent as Vice President of the European Commission. And I really liked the comment that Federica Mogherini was making about the optimism of the will. So there's, of course, also the other side of the coin, also the person who will be appointed to this position. And I assume that all of you, of course, start your day with opening the newsletter of Politico, right? So there is a certain name in the room of a prime minister of a Baltic country. And we do see that, and the person who will be appointed to this position also really should go for it full scale, like Federica was saying this. So with optimism and also with the courage, let's say, to perhaps even break a wall that is there in terms of institutional competition with other presidents. And this brings me to my very final point, if I still have 1 minute. And this goes, let's say, to the very rationale of the European project. We had here Javier Solana in the panel before, let's say, from another time of the European integration project. And what we see in our research is basically that we need another kind of union, basically. So we had so far a union that integrates. There were, this narrative of, ever-increasing union that is basically based on single market, focused on economic benefits that, of course, were crucial and are still crucial for several member states. But now we need a union that protects its values, that protects its members and its neighborhood. And for that, we need basically to harness our competences in a different way that we are used to that. And to that, you have a range of recommendations in the white paper. I would just briefly mention, really briefly, 3 aspects. We do talk about the unique competencies of the EU in defense and security, namely the legislative and financial instruments that we actually saw in play during the EU response to the war in Ukraine. Then we talk a lot about strategic partnerships that we propose to make much more issues-based and selective as well, in the spirit of strategic selectivity. And of course, also transactional. This is the way we actually also see the EU proceeding with partners, like-minded partners across the world. And then finally, we do have a couple of recommendations in the white paper going into EU External Action Plus, so the mainstreaming of policies run by European Commission and by the External Action Service. And this all brings me basically to the point that was already made in the previous panel. We do see that the EU has to be much more proactive and confront the challenges that are there in the outer world to some extent, in order to continue not only to thrive, but actually to continue to survive as a European value-based project. So this is basically how my 5-minute, very distinct summary of the white paper looks like. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to do it.
Thank you, Monica. This is a bit self-serving if I say this, but I don't know of many Horizon Europe projects which can get drilled down to an elevator pitch in the form that you've just presented it. So thank you. We will go into the weeds of this in just a minute. But before that, Tanja Lacic, you work for the Managing Director for Peace, Security and Defense in the External Action Service. What is your outlook on the time after the election? And if you care, how do you evaluate some of the recommendations that the project has come forth with?
Thank you so much. And well, first of all, congratulations on this massive, massive endeavor. And really, it's always a challenge to have a 10-point plan, and it's a really good one, I have to say. So let me make 3 brief points, kind of picking up on your first question, and then also on some of the recommendations that you coincidentally also mentioned here. My 3 points are on readiness, on Ukraine, and on partnerships. So first on readiness. And I actually wanted to start this with a question. For those that have been, I think there's many in the room that have been watching kind of the ups and downs of EU defense policy. Have you heard the EU speak of defense readiness before? Because if you have, please let me know, because I haven't. So, this in itself, to me, is a symbol of a shift that we have experienced, and we're seeing now after 2 years of war at our borders. And just yesterday we were at the EUISS annual conference, and Bastian was speaking in a panel, and I think you were referring to this mindset, right, that we need in Europe to overcome the state of unpreparedness, if I quote you correctly. I wrote this down. And I think he's right. And having the privilege of being in the room where these discussions happen and seeing a bit the rough and tough of it, I can really tell you that we're witnessing the shift. It may come with ups and downs, it does, but the shift is there and it's here to stay. So that's just one point. Now, back to defense readiness. What does the shift mean concretely? Well, I think we're about to see a really big test. So now, if you haven't been watching the European Council website and the different conclusions lately, in March, we received a really bold tasking, right? As the Commission, Council, the tasking was we need to identify all options to mobilize defense financing. And we need to deliver this by June. So we're working round the clock, basically, to see what does this mean. So this will be, I think, a big test, and I think it will be a test of this mind shift that we're seeing. But just through this task, I think we are seeing that EU leaders in the European Council now look at the EU as providing a solution for defense readiness. And I think this is the part of this political necessity that Federica Mogherini was also referring to. So this is, to me, a big shift. I think it's commensurate with the urgency and with the needs that we are facing. So this is the kind of response that we need. Also in a context, of course, where we witness Russia's war economy, we see how much they're spending on defense. I think it's over 7% of GDP just this year. So here, I think we have 2 dimensions to address. One is more internal, member states. And here we need to basically find ways in defense to repair the past. So to address all these structural problems that we can go into during the Q&A if you're interested in. The defense fragmentation, lack of doing stuff together, these sort of things. And at the same time, prepare for the future. It's these 2 dimensions. You can't have one without the other. This is the scale of the effort that is needed. Now, the second dimension is quasi-internal. It's Ukraine, right? We need to, as a minimum, maintain our level of support to Ukraine, and most realistically, we'll have to increase our level of support to Ukraine, including militarily. And I think your recommendations also clearly say that we need a lot more money and a much better way of spending it if we want to increase our defense readiness and then also to strengthen NATO and NATO's posture in Europe. Second quick point, Ukraine. Just a quick overview, what have we done? So far, over 100 billion of assistance all round have been delivered by the EU. More will come. Zooming into the security and defense field, 35 billion of military support. Again, more will come. We're just finalizing now work on using the windfall profits stemming from the Russian frozen assets. Massive work. I mean, who would have thought the EU would do this? Seriously now, I work there and I'm shocked, you know? This is the kind of thing that we're witnessing. We trained over 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers so far. More will be trained. The EU is now the largest provider of military training to Ukraine. That's where we are. We're finalizing negotiations for security commitments with Ukraine, and we're working to integrate the Ukrainian defense industry into our own defense industrial base. That's what we've done. What do we need looking ahead? We need to obviously deliver on these security commitments and on the pledge that the European Council has made to support for as long as it takes. We need more money, more training, more defense industry. So the new leadership, however it will look like, will need to deliver on all of these lines of effort and also increase it. So that's just very quickly on Ukraine. Third point on partnerships. I think overall, the response that the EU has had to the war has really had a positive impact on our credibility abroad. I mean, Bastian here is the master of the Shangri-La. I keep pointing at you. That just happened a few weeks ago. And I watched really closely the speech of the Japanese defense minister. The first global challenge that he referred to was the Russian aggression in Ukraine, not East Asia. It was the Russian aggression in Ukraine. I was myself in Tokyo and in Seoul a few weeks ago, and I can tell you straight from the lion's mouth that these partners want more of the EU in the Indo-Pacific. And this is just one example of one region. So overall, what we're seeing is a surging demand for partners to do more with us in security and defense. So coming to your recommendations to kind of your recommendation to redesign partnership on key issues, I think you put it. To address that, we've designed a new mechanism that now we call security and defense partnerships, or what I think in the FT or Politico was security pact, because it sounds a bit sexier. To precisely express this strategic selectivity. We are doing it because there's a need to kind of have a bit of more transactional, in a positive way, I think, relationship with partners in security and defense, and because there's this demand. We struck a deal with Moldova, we struck a deal with Norway, more is to come. So we are putting in practice this tailor-made kind of partnership that we have also committed to in the Compass. To wrap it up, in conclusion, whoever they may be, I think the HRVP will have first the task to enable coherence and trust among member states in what looks like a more politically fragmented union, and that's no small feat. Happy to go into this in the discussion. And then also, as you also point out, and as I think the previous panel pointed out, connect the dots across EU foreign policy. The interconnection has become so much more obvious, from crisis management to resilience, how do each other enable resilience, how defense readiness fits into that, and how we have to continue to deliver for Ukraine. So I note your ambitions for the HRVP. I cannot comment on them, but duly noted. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tanya. And thanks also for considering and responding to some of the recommendations that the group has made. Bastian, you're an insider-outsider here. You are part of the consortium. IISS is part of the consortium. But at the same time, and Shangri-La was mentioned, you are mainly based outside of the European Union, your think tank, if I can say so. Unfortunately so for your headquarters. But with that perspective, and to not only be EU navel gazing here, tell us a little bit from the world outside of Brussels, outside of the EU. You know, do they laugh about our 10-point plan?
I don't think they've seen it yet, but look. Well, thank you very much, and let me just actually start by, as someone who, as many in the team and many in the room here, someone who has worked on foreign European security defense policy stuff for quite some time. I think it was a real treat, that panel that we just had moderated by Rosa, but it was really very, very good to get these impressions and be reminded that times have always been difficult, and there were always quite severe challenges that looked very, very existential at the time. But I do take, as a starting point, perhaps, Javier Solana's assessment that maybe this time is different. And the paper, of course, makes that point as well, that we are at a critical geopolitical moment that we need to deal with, that we need to embrace. And the question that raises, of course, is can the EU and can European foreign policy be a geopolitical force in a positive sense? And I would agree with those who have suggested that doing that now has become more difficult because the world is a bit rougher, the world is more dangerous, and that, of course, sits uneasily with the identity, the character of the EU and many of the instruments that it has available to promote foreign policy priorities. And therefore, the call for selectiveness, another one of the key elements in that plan, I think is an important one. So now I have to be both loyal to this effort that we were all part of, and yet play a bit of a of an outsider role here, looking in. And the first thing that one really needs to underline is how severe the challenge to the rules-based order is, how many countries around the world think that they want something that is a bit different, but haven't yet alighted on what that might be. But for a group of countries that represents a highly regulated, rules-based system interacting with that more contested and rougher world in itself is a big problem. Rules are being broken by very important actors in that system, and we haven't quite managed to come up with a response to that, and we haven't quite figured out how multilateralism can fill some of the gaps that result from it. That's not a problem just for Europeans, but it's also a problem for Europeans writ large. And while there are many in the Pacific and in Asia who welcome more engagement and seek more engagement, as Tanya has said, there are also those who look at us and say, well, your continent is at war. You have failed. You know, your order has failed. Why should we listen to you? We don't want what you have because you have war. And there are many in the Pacific who say, we haven't had war for decades here. So, you know, what do you have to teach us? It's an important realization. If we kind of look at ourselves from the outside, some of this looks terrible. We have an imperial war of conquest on our continent. You know, that realization is one that we should heed. We have across the Atlantic a partner who, where some parts of the political spectrum think we still haven't woken up to the real threat, which is China, in their view. We are hesitant around the threat on our own continent, and we're still not quite serious when it comes to security and defense. And I think that's actually almost independent of what the outcome is in November. We have in the Middle East, I mean, I don't need to tell you this, but we struggle to come up with a coherent view. And as a result, we do hear about inconsistencies and double standards. And the funny thing is that we get very defensive when we hear that, rather than explain actually what the position is, and why maybe one thing isn't like the other, and so on. And I find that puzzling, that we immediately get into a defensive crouch when we hear that. It isn't hard to point out the inconsistencies in the foreign policies of Arab nation when it comes to, I don't know, Syria and a couple of other places. So this isn't about who's better and who isn't, but it's perhaps creating a shared understanding of the fact that these things are very complicated and difficult, and that we are trying with the means that we have available. I think what a lot of partners and competitors and rivals see when they look at Europe is a lack of staying power. In the Pacific, certainly. People look at strategy papers that nations have written, naval visits that nations have conducted, other exercise activity, and they say, now that you've done that, and we welcome your engagement. And we've seen the papers, and we understand that you're interested in our region because of your own prosperity and security. What are you going to do now? How are you going to bring this to life? How are you going to fill this vessel that you have created? How are you going to meet the expectations that you have now raised, which is, of course, one of the fundamental problems of European foreign policy. So staying power and the unity that is required to develop staying power is important. So I'll just finish with two areas that I think we might discuss as areas of opportunity. One, I think, is economic statecraft, because that is something that is such a vibrant area right now, where other countries are, creating ministries for economic security, where the EU and its member states are leveraging economic tools for the purposes of statecraft every day. And I would argue there we really have something to offer and something to work with. And I would also point out to defense as the other area of opportunity, despite the many failures along the way, and despite that, I really do think we are unprepared right now. And I apologize to those who have heard me say this before, but the fact that we are unprepared, there is no structural reason for it. It's a result of our policy choices, so therefore we can change them. And if we can't manage that now, then people will laugh at us. But I think we have it within our means to prevent that outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Bastian. I do like the optimism here on the panel. As was mentioned previously, we're running a bit behind the schedule. So what I will do now is I will have a follow-up question to each of you, but then I will open up to the audience, to everyone in the room. Since you must have realized that we have an interest in having very balanced panels, the previous one and this one, and you may have noted 3 male speakers asking questions in the first round. I encourage everyone who doesn't consider himself male to come up with a question for this round. Over to you, Monica. The HRVP question, and Tanya rightly refused to comment on it. How do we do this? I mean, how can this not just be a political choice of whoever fits the job and then we'll do everything else around it? What is it that the group recommends?
This is like $1 million question. I will try to answer, but may I just briefly comment on Bastian's remarks regarding, actually, Tanya also was mentioning this regarding, well, let's say the urgency about, defending our rules and our order. And I would also perhaps link it to, I think sometimes somehow underlying question of Rosa in the previous panel. What I'm saying is that I do think that we have to really well, I mean, if we don't defend Ukraine, our reputation is totally broken, right? So this is really what at stake now. So we have to show power as the EU, and we have to show that we are able to defend our neighbor that has been under attack since 2.5 years, right? And if we are not able to do this, well, then I don't wonder that partners will laugh or are already laughing. So this is just one comment. On the HRVP, well, I mean, again, we discussed it briefly before. It's, as a group of researchers, we, on the one hand, have the comfortable position that we can comment on names, of course, because we are just researchers, we are not involved in the EU institutions. But on the other hand, of course, we also are very much aware of the fact that, well, I mean, we can comment on that, but we can't really influence that. So we can just appeal to the political leaders to appoint someone that is really heavy-weighted. And this is exactly my answer to your question. So I would really like to see finally someone in this position that is heavyweight, like a former prime minister of a country. And over lunch, we had a very good discussion with Javier, and he told me that he thinks that one of the reasons he was very respective to some extent HRVP, right? I think we can all agree on that without having all the powers of the vice president that the next HRVP actually had, he was still able to make a difference, and he was able to really change the EU foreign policy and to bring it forward. So the reason for that was that he was a former NATO General Secretary. So he had the reputation among the member states and the power, to convince them to do something, and perhaps even, as he said, to make some very bold moves. And we need someone in this position with a kind of a similar heavyweight, I would say.
Thank you. Tanya, there was previously, I think, Federica Mogherini, she mentioned the things that only the EU can do and that differentiate the European Union from other actors. And you spoke a lot about readiness mindset, defense readiness, and defending Ukraine. But the EU is not going to be, I may safely say, is not going to be like a nation state investing in its own defense, not for the immediate future. So I'm going to, in my question to you, I would like to focus on these things that only the EU can do. The group, for example, in the 10-point plan mentions the connection between enlargement and neighborhood policy. There is the question of external action plus, things only the EU can do. Where do you see the focus being for the next 5 years in these areas? Is this something where things have to change a lot, where the EU can, alongside investing into its defense and its mindset, is this something that the EU could and should strengthen?
I think that the defense dimension that we see manifesting internally in the EU is definitely already having a foreign policy impact. And I think Federica Mogherini hinted at this at the, I don't know how she put it, the external outreach or impact of our internal policies. I think this is the way we do defense, and then the way we see the world are starting to come together. While before, I think they were much more kind of separate. So I would see the EU becoming more transactional, perhaps. I used the word before, but I think we see the world in a much more clear-eyed way, and I think already the strategic compass has shown us that. I mean, the compass, I think, in many ways is still valid, because if you look at the way threats are described already, then Russia is the biggest threat to European security. It's there. This still remains the case. I think that's probably the case across policy fields. Perhaps on China, I think the vision is evolving a bit more. There were big news today, for example, on our China policy. And I think the way the EU sees itself now, which has already evolved in foreign policy, by adding a security dimension, is that as a smart security enabler. And this is a concept that we've started to use, and I think the High Representative used it in Shangri-La as well, because I think it captivates quite well what the EU can do. The EU is not going to go to the Indo-Pacific and be this big military power and showing off how many assets we have. We sometimes do that. We have joint naval exercises. We did that with the Americans as well. We do it with the Indians and so on. We want to do it with the Japanese. So we're doing that. We're showing our flag. We're showing that we have things to show. But at the same time, it's in a much more subtle way and cooperative way, because the EU still, I think, has quite a bit of convening power, still has quite a high degree of magnetism. If we look at the ASEAN region, for example, and how ASEAN was conceived or how the African Union was conceived, that magnetism is there. And then it's about, and I think this was also a big theme in yesterday's EUISS conference, how do we create leverage? This is, the awakening is there, I think, much more precisely in the economic statecraft field, in the geoeconomic field. And I think in the defense and foreign policy field, this is starting to become much more apparent. And these security pacts or security and defense partnerships, to use the proper legal word of it, are a big step forward. Because in fact, we do deliver a lot through our partnerships in the region, but it was done in a very scattered way until now. We have a cyber dialogue, we have a maritime dialogue, we work on hybrid threats, but it's all scattered. So now we're trying to bring that together in a much more political way and then try to create leverage and then ideally also use it. I think in the cyber field, we're doing that quite a bit. We have a cyber policy that has teeth. We can have cyber sanctions. How can we think in this in these terms in other security and defense policies as well, and try to scale it up, basically?
Thank you. Bastian, the follow-up question, you've mentioned it already, the economic side of things, economic security. The paper itself mentions the global gateway. That's just one piece of the picture. Sanctions as a tool of foreign policy that we've seen grown over the past 15, 20 years, especially in the European Union, but also on the other side of the Atlantic. What's the weight of this dimension? You mentioned it as a special point to look at, but what specifically would you say the European Union should do?
I mean, I think the realization has to be that the spheres of economics and security are inherently linked, and that they're not playing fields that we try to separate out, which some nations in Europe, the one that I hail from, liked to do, and that's an important point. And And so you've mentioned some of the levers to pull there, but I think and one is there are some that are coercive and really are tools of punishment or to induce a change in behavior. They're tools of coercive diplomacy, but I think there's the offer side of it as well that we need to leverage, much in the way that Tanya has just explained, to actually make this count and bring it together. So if we look around the world and we realize a lot of people around the world actually do not agree with our priorities, and we might consider them fence sitters, they will not come off the fence unless there's an offer, unless we have something that we can say, and this is what you will get from us. And the offer isn't be like us. The offer needs to be transactional, and it needs to be selective. And then one can get somewhere. Very basic example that I apologize in advance for making it so crude. But if we go to certain countries and say, we would like you to buy less arms from Russia, we need to come and say, and this is what you can get from us. Not terribly popular, but that is, of course, the question that will immediately any diplomat on the other side who's worth their salt will immediately ask. And we need to think in those kinds of terms and understand this as an area of foreign policy and statecraft that I think is only gaining in importance. And we've heard some of the examples, of course, Russian asset freezing, seizing, and then perhaps redistributing is an element of that as well. By the way, in case there's any doubt left, I think there is a very strong international law argument that this is entirely appropriate as a countermeasure to the damage that Russia is causing. So I think we should get on with that.
Okay, and as promised, over to you. I have a first question in the back of the room, and she didn't need the encouragement from me, Judy. And then anyone else who wants to speak, please raise their hand, and the microphone will come to you.
Yeah, thank you, Cornelius. Monica came under enough pressure at lunchtime. Hello, Bastian. I've got one question. Hence, in terms of foreign policy and relations with Europe, conditionality is a big problem when you look at the global gate. China can do things with Latin American countries in Africa without conditionality. Why should they come with us? Also, we have double standards. If you're going to tell countries not to sell Russia, well, some of the EU member states to do this. But my question is this: the 2003, the first EU security strategy, and this one, which is a kind of strategy, don't mention the N word. Don't mention NATO.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? We have a question from the online audience, which I forgot to say hello to Monica. You're collecting questions. Doesn't transactionalism with like-minded countries fall somewhat short of the level expected between close partners and allies? You got that? Any further questions? I didn't want to scare anyone into asking a question. I apologize. Last row. And the microphone seems to have issues. So unless you really get it close to yourself, I don't know whether that's self. Yes.
Thank you. From Open Society, I have a question and comment. My question is related to the fact that in the research you say about being strategic, where EU will invest. How do you hold it against the factor that EU is accused a lot in double standards, what it is doing in Ukraine and is not doing elsewhere? How would you hold this? And my comment is to the comment by one of the panelists that countries in Asia Pacific criticize us. Look, your model doesn't work, you have a war. And I think it's not that EU model doesn't work. It's one country violated UN Charter. It's the UN system that is not working. I think we have to be very upward and straight about this, what is not working. And those countries are part of the UN. And I think we should make sure the international rules-based order is working within which EU is part of. So to be able to respond in a right way to this rhetorics from the global South countries. I think it's very important.
Thank you. Seeing no more hands being raised, I will hand it back to you. Tanya, do you want to comment on any of the issues, which gives Monica a little bit more time? Okay, Tanya.
Sure, why not? Maybe on the last question, I think you can look at it in many different ways, but I think objectively speaking, and also from looking at it internally and a bit self-critically, the EU clearly has a narrative problem. We know it. It's not controversial. I don't think I'll get fired to say that. We have a narrative problem, and it's also because we're not a federation yet, and it's sometimes difficult to. For that, no, that's fine. That gets me a promotion. But jokes aside, I think we really have a narrative issue, and this will be a task for the next High Representative as well, to explain perhaps a bit less defensively, as I think Bastian has said it, what exactly is the situation, what are the stakes, and why perhaps it's in all countries' interest to rally against what Russia has done, and how it's happening in Europe now, but it may happen in your neighborhood soon enough. So that's a bit, I think, part of the message that we need to pass. Then, because I heard NATO, I didn't hear what about NATO was said, but as someone who works on security and defense, I'm very closely with NATO, actually. To put out a comment, kind of looking ahead, that I think I hope that we will see a next level in the EU-NATO relationship, and hope so also for the transatlantic relationship in the sense of EU-US, as the EU is taking more responsibility for its security and defense. And I think narrative is also important here. We've heard a lot about complementarity and non-duplication. Of course, no one should do that. We do have limited resources, but I think if we do manage to make a step change in the EU in how we treat defense and how we treat our defense industry, and make a step change in how member states see the EU as providing solutions to problems that both NATO and the EU are facing, and all member states are facing, then I think we're going to see a next level NATO, and then that comes with the next level EU-NATO cooperation on defense. So just a plug there.
Cool, thank you.
Up on that, and thank you, Judy, for the question. NATO, we do have a case study on EU-NATO in our 50+ working papers, obviously. But for the reasons of strategic selectivity that we also had to, use to write this 10-point plan, we decided not to include this in the final document. But I can just agree with everything that Tanya just said. We did, of course, let's say, put some specific proposals towards how to make the strategic partnership between EU-NATO, that on paper is again absolutely brilliant, actually into practice. And I can elaborate on that later if you want, but basically, and I agree, I think that something has changed and shifted in this relationship between EU and NATO, because the EU really stepped up in the EU response to Ukraine, and some NATO allies also recognize that more and more. So I think what we are seeing now is basically really a much closer cooperation of these two international organizations, not only in terms of Ukraine, but also on other portfolios like cyber resilience and other issues that are as much important as, of course, the hard defense-oriented cooperation. On the question on transactionalism, well, I mean, at least in our research and at least in the white paper, we do refer rather to transactionalism that we would like to apply much more, not necessarily to like-minded partners. So there is, of course, it's hard to define what like-minded partner is if you want to do it in an academic and comprehensive way. And I still do think that we have, of course, close partners and allies that we don't have to be transactional with. But beyond these partners, there are also other countries that we do have to or do want to cooperate on different selected issues. Again, and for that, we need to be a bit more transactional, definitely. And I think the word transactional has been repeated many times, but by every one of us here and also by the previous panel. So I think there is definitely something that the EU should leverage more. And finally, on the whole, perhaps, construct of the international world order, we do see much more informality that we've seen before. We do see much more, coalitions of the willings, flexible cooperation structures, and this is everything that the EU also should be leveraging with the instruments that we have.
Bastian, what do you respond?
Judy, when you said the N-word, I thought you were going to say nuclear, but NATO I find a bit easier. And Monica has already said a few things, but I think look, I mean, my view is that if we're talking deterrence and defense posture, I think there's no alternative to NATO. If we have to think about a world in which the US for whatever reason decides to either lessen its engagement or walks away from it, I'll just point you to a study that we've done in 2019 that explains what the task would be then for us and what kind of investments we would have to make to be credible in that sector as Europeans alone. And frankly, at that point, I'm forum agnostic as to where we would do that, as long as we do that. Very quickly on double standards, that point, and I think it actually links to selectivity and transactionalism. Because I think the dirty secret of foreign policy is that you will always have what people call double standards, what I would prefer to call inconsistencies, because we don't have the means to fix everything that is coming our way. My personal view, but this is not a consortium view, it's just my personal view. My personal view is the more our foreign policy is based on values, the more open we will be to challenges of inconsistencies in a world where rules are being broken, because that creates value challenges for us as Europeans at every intersection along that way. So I think that's one of the reasons why this is a harder environment for us, despite progress that was alluded to, that was pointed out. And as always, the real question is not, are we running faster than we ran before? The question is, are we running fast enough to keep up with what's happening around us? And there we have work to do. And hopefully the 10 ideas in the paper contribute to that.
I'm sure they will. Just on this point of war in Europe being so much of a bad omen for the continent and the model as such, versus the question of it's the rules-based world order, it's the UN system. I mean, in the previous panel, Federica Mogherini said, we need some self-confidence. And wouldn't it be then appropriate also to say, well, it's not the European system that is broken or that failed to prevent this, but that there is maybe something, a higher order that has failed?
It would be disingenuous, and we would be lying into our own pockets if we didn't acknowledge that the fundamentals of our European security order are violated every day at the moment. And if we can't acknowledge this and say, well, let's shift blame, let's move one up and locate the problem at the UN level, I don't think we would gain. We would just dilute our own the lever that we have ourselves to do anything about that. I mean, people might not agree with that, but I think that's a real challenge. And the other point is just to acknowledge that is how it is seen from the outside, and we can argue with that, and I'd be happy to argue our case, but that's the perception in other parts of the world, and it's good practice to start with acknowledging that.
Thank you. And it's good practice to listen to those other parts of the world and to see what they have to say, and to see how we can, work with them and get along with them. We are already ahead of time, so apologies for that, but we're coming to a close. The good news is that this doesn't stop here with us sitting on the panel and discussing with you, but that there will be a reception. So, lift up your spirits. There will be an opportunity also to discuss among yourselves and with the panelists. I take away a couple of things from this discussion. First of all, that you shouldn't call it double standards, but just call it inconsistencies and work with them. Secondly, that Europe does have a narrative problem, but there is also a positive message that needs to come out of the next commission, and that maybe the 10-point plan can be a part of the discussion around this. With that, I will leave it. I will thank once more the panelists, Tanja, Monica, and Bastian. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you especially to the young diplomats from the Academy, from the European Diplomatic Academy. Thank you to everyone who joined online and to the consortium partners for an excellent project. Thank you.